So how's everyone's quarantine going? Today I want to talk about something kind of niche, but I think something that we should talk about more in the beer world, and that is the intersection of coffee and beer. Obviously both coffee and beer have followings. You know, there are coffee people and there are beer people, and even if you're not a coffee person or a beer person, chances are you enjoy one or both from time to time. So I wanted to talk about all the times when coffee and beer intersect. It's kind of a surprise to me that it doesn't happen more often because they're both beverages that can have so many different flavor notes and a real tasting culture behind it. Unsurprisingly, actually, Modern Times Brewing in Southern California has a whole line of coffee products, not coffee beers, but coffees alongside their beers. I think it's kind of surprising that we don't see more of that, actually. So if you've ever been out at a brewery or a bar and you see a beer that says something about coffee notes, now that can refer to a bunch of different things. That can refer to beers that actually have coffee in them, or it can refer to a beer that just has coffee notes, tastes like coffee. And the kind of beers that you're likely to find that in are porters and stouts, those dark beers, because when the malt gets roasted to that really high degree, you tend to release flavors like coffee and sometimes chocolate or other things like that that are very deep and rich and roasty. So a lot of the times if you see a beer that's described as having coffee notes or coffee-ish, there's very likely not even any actual coffee in it. It's just a standard beer that has notes that reflect that sort of palate. But a lot of times brewers do add coffee in one form or another to a beer. And again, that shouldn't really be surprising. I think the two can pair together very well, and often you'll see this happen again in porters and stouts and those kinds of beers that are already dark and rich and roasty. But more and more we're seeing brewers experiment by adding it to other styles like Oktoberfest and pumpkin ales and things like that. I think it's always really exciting to see new kinds of pairings like that. If you're a person who's like kind of weirded out by the idea of coffee beers, I get it. It's a beverage that you usually have in the morning and a beverage that you usually have in the evening paired together. And if you're not really into dark, roasty kind of beers in the first place, it might just not seem all that appealing to you. But I think that we could totally be enjoying coffee beers on a wider scale for more occasions. I mean, just think about it, like it would be the perfect brunch drink. Why is a coffee beer not right up there with mimosas and Bloody Marys as the drinks that you order at brunch? It makes perfect sense, right? If it's culturally acceptable to drink mimosas and Bloody Marys at noon on a Sunday, I don't see why a coffee beer wouldn't be. It's probably lower alcohol than the cocktail. You're probably wondering if coffee beers have any caffeine in them. If you like coffee beers but are worried about drinking them late at night, you might also be wondering if there's any caffeine in them. And the answer is generally no. Not really. I wrote an article on this a while back and I spoke to several different brewers who make coffee beers either regularly or on occasion. What they all said is that if there's any caffeine in the final beer, it's probably a negligible amount. When they use whole beans and at no point in the process does it get up to the temperature that coffee normally would, you're not going to release the amount of caffeine that would be in a cup of coffee. Although sometimes beers are made with coffee that is already brewed, in which case you will get some of that caffeine. However, they're probably not made with very much of that coffee. The most I've ever heard of a beer having in caffeine content is up to 1/4 cup of coffee. So unless you're someone who is very, very sensitive to caffeine, you probably don't have to worry about a coffee beer in the evening keeping you up all night. There aren't a lot of breweries that have coffee beers as part of their regular central roundup. It's usually something that'll be more of like a limited edition here and there kind of thing. So I don't know that I can recommend one that you can go out and buy or order in to buy right now. But one of my favorites, which is a seasonal one, hopefully we'll see it again this year, Coney Island Brewing does their Freaktoberfest, or last year they did Super Freak. That one is a pumpkin ale that is also made with coffee beans or cold brew, depending on which version they're doing. You stop it. So hopefully we'll see that again this fall. Gun Hill Brewing in the Bronx on occasion has beers made with coffee that in my memory have been really good. They have one called Doin' Breakfast Time, which appropriate, right? Also, Gun Hill's Void of Light is a good example of a stout that's not made with coffee but has coffee notes. I've actually had it with dinner before and it work surprisingly well. So since we're talking so much about food, I think it's worth mentioning that coffee beers, be it really roasty stouts or beers actually made with coffee, regardless of the style, they pair really well with food. So when it comes to beer and food pairings, there's a lot to talk about. You might want your beer to contrast or to match with what you're eating, depending on what it is. And I should make a whole nother video about this because there's tons to talk about. Dark, roasty, coffee-ish beers are really good with dessert. Obviously, anything with chocolate or, you know, coffee or caramel or biscuity flavors in them pairs really well with a beer that has those similar notes. If you're having a sweet brunch, a coffee beer is a great way to go, you know, with your French toast or whatever. Also, if you're just having like a standard like pancakes, maple syrup, bacon, that kind of thing, if you do that, coffee beer pairs well with all of that. That heavy flavor works well with a variety of foods. A really strong roasty stout can stand up to really fatty foods and really sweet foods and those other strong flavors that you normally wouldn't think to pair with a beverage. It's really common for these beers to also be sweet, to be intentionally sweet beers, either a little bit or very, very sweet. Some pastry stouts are made with coffee, but not all are. Some have a much more neutral, savory flavor, and that makes them good for pairing with savory foods as well. I think pairing a sweet beer with savory foods is maybe tricky, but definitely not out of the question. However, something like Gun Hill's Void of Light, which is a much more neutral flavor, works well with anything that's roasted or charred or otherwise has those like very strong flavors released in that process. Really heavy protein rich dishes will work with them. It's probably not the kind of beer that you would want to pair with a salad, unless, you know, anything's possible. I like coffee. I like to drink coffee. I drink it pretty much every day, and I've been drinking black coffee for, you know, since middle school. But having too much coffee will eventually give you that really gross acidic taste in your mouth and throat, and you don't feel well. And of course, coffee has all kinds of other side effects too. So there are reasons that we typically don't just drink coffee all day, although there are certainly people who do. It becomes less enjoyable to drink a lot of coffee all day. We can say that. With coffee beers, you usually don't get that effect because the roasty flavor and the acidity are balanced out by the other characteristics of beer, like the carbonation. So it's a really good palate for the bitterness and the acidity of coffee while also balancing those traits out and making it a really well-rounded beverage. Personally, I think it's a match made in heaven, and absolutely every brewery should be experimenting with coffee. So that's all I want to talk about for now. If you're into these oddball flavors of beers, check out my video about sour beers. Let me know if there are any other topics that you'd like to hear me talk about when it comes to questions that you have about beer or things you just want to know more about. Give me a like, give me a subscribe. I hope you're all staying healthy and safe and have your pantries well stocked out there.